Hey there guys, it's Obaid from Obaid, and in this tutorial I'm going to teach you how to use geometry nodes and create this scene in Blender. If you don't know what is geometry nodes, it is a node based system by which you can create and manipulate geometry within nodes. So without further ado, let's deep dive into the video. Open up Blender and make sure that you have installed Blender version 2.92 or later, and also make sure to download this file because we are going to use some assets from this file. So first of all, I'm gonna delete the default cube because it's always useless. Then I'm gonna add a plane and scale it up by a factor of 10. Then I'm gonna subdivide it by a number of 50 times. Then add a subdivision modifier of level 1. Then add a displacement modifier and make a new texture. Rename it to like something large bumps. Open up the texture editor and change the texture type to clouds. And you may have noticed that this size value is pretty small, but on our plane these bumps look pretty big. This is because we haven't applied the scale after scaling it up. As you can see here, the scale value is set to 10 on all the three axes. So let me apply the scale by pressing Ctrl A, and now the scale value will be set to 1 on all the three axes. Now let me increase the size to something around 2. Like this. Then I'm gonna decrease the strength a little bit, something like this. I'm gonna choose shade smooth, and I'm gonna delete this lamp because we don't need it. Then I'm gonna add another displacement modifier, but this time we are gonna make some smaller bumps. Small bumps. Go to the texture tab and decrease down the scale as you want. Uh, something like this. Then I'm gonna decrease the strength down to something like this. Then I'm gonna go to view navigation and walk navigation, and then you can use WSD keys to move around like in games. You can also use Q and E key to move up and down. Move your camera where you are satisfied. I'm gonna place my camera something like over here and hit the left mouse button. I'm gonna increase the subdivision level to 2 and maybe decrease down this strength value a little bit, something like this. Then I'm gonna go to edit mode and enable proportional editing and randomize this a little bit. You can scroll up and down to change the fall off. Decrease this down like this. Then I'm gonna also decrease down this size value a little bit, something like this. And now we're gonna create a rock for scattering it on our ground. So before that, make sure to enable add mesh extra objects add-on, by which you'll be able to add more objects in the mesh menu. So select rock generator. I'm gonna uncheck the use random seed option because when we change any of these values, our rock is randomly changing. And now we can control the seed by changing this value. Decrease down the detail level to 2. Move this here so it's not visible in the camera. For the ground material, I'm gonna open up a new window and change the editor type to shader editor. I'm gonna choose this material and rename this to ground. Then enable the node wrangler add-on, which is a very awesome add-on that speeds up your node based workflow. And now you can select the principal BSDF and hit Ctrl Shift T and add a principal texture setup. So I'm gonna search for a texture ground, regular 2K, and select the color normal and the gloss map, and it will add a principal texture setup by itself. I'm gonna scale the texture up, and for the rock make sure to UV project this. I'm gonna choose cube projection and add a new material, rename it to rock. Then I'm gonna again hit Ctrl Shift T and select a rock texture, rock, and select the color normal and the roughness map. And for the background, change the shader type to word, and I'm gonna add a sky texture. The strength is too high, so I'm gonna decrease it down to 0.25. I'm gonna rotate the sun by 90 degrees, increase the altitude to 2, and decrease down the elevation to 8. Select the plane, change the editor type to geometry node editor, make a new node tree and rename it to something like rocks. And by default there will be always two nodes. This is our mesh input and this is the output. So if we disconnect this, our mesh will be gone. So connect that up. And in fact, geometry nodes is a modifier, as you can see here. So that means if we add another mesh like a plane or any object, we can add a geometry node editor and select the same node tree. Since we don't want that, I'm gonna undo the steps. So before scattering this rock on our plane, let me explain some basic nodes. Like you can move, rotate and scale any object by adding a transform node, geometry transform node, and changing these values. And any slider in the geometry nodes can be animated. So let me set these back to 0. Hover over these sliders and press I to keyframe the animation. Then change the frame. Change the value of any of these sliders. I'm going to change the z-axis value and then press I again, and now you can see the animation. Since we don't want the animation, I'm going to undo these steps. You can also add a subdivision surface modifier inside the nodes. You can see the effect because our mesh has been subdivided already. But you can see the effect if I change the display mode to wireframe and change the level. You can also see the effect if I disable this for a second and now change this level. I'm gonna delete these nodes because we don't want that. So let's scatter this rock on our plane. So for that we have to generate some points on our plane from which the rock will be spawned. So I'm gonna add a point distribute node, and our mesh has gone because our mesh has been converted into points. So to fix that, you can add a join geometry node and plug this in, and now our mesh is back. You can change the number of points by this slider. So to distribute this rock on these points, we have to add a point instance node. You can do that by searching or you can just go point and select point instance. You can either choose an object or collection, but for now we are gonna use object. So you can select the rock by this eyedropper tool, and now our rock has been spawned from those points. If we wouldn't add this point distribute node before instancing our object, what will happen is our instanced object will be instanced on each of the vertices of our mesh. Since we have a lot of vertices, we have a lot of rocks, and the number of vertices is also increased by this subdivision modifier, as you can see here. So let me plug in the point distribute node. There's a problem that these rocks are intersecting. So there's a solution for that. We can change the point distribution method to Poisson disk or whatever it's pronounced. And now we have a new distance minimum slider which we can increase to set a minimum distance value between these points.
It's much more like social distancing.
I'm gonna decrease the number of rocks because we don't want these many rocks. Something like this is good. And we can also scale our object by adding an attribute fill node. And now we can type in any attribute and change its value. So if you don't know what's an attribute is a set of characters that is used to reference data. For example, position is an attribute that contains the x, y, and z coordinates of every point on a geometry. So we can type in the scale attribute and change the value to affect the size of our object. The type of data is set to float, which is a single value, but you can change it to vector, which contains the xyz values, and now we can change the scale values of each individual axis. Since we don't want that, I'm going to change that back to float. But these rocks are of the same scale. We want some randomness because nature is irregular, it's not so uniform. So we can add in an attribute randomize node which randomizes an attribute. So you can now type in an attribute, set its minimum and maximum value. I'm gonna set the minimum value around 0.2 and the maximum value to around 0.5. But now this attribute fill node isn't affecting anything because we have used the same attribute twice, therefore the scale attribute is overridden. So if you want to add this attribute randomize effect on top of this attribute fill node, what you can do now is create an other attribute by yourself. Like we can rename this to scale 2 and add another node called attribute mix node, which mixes two attributes with this factor value. And now we can type in our scale attribute, and in the second attribute we'll type the scale 2 at which we have just created, and we have to define the result also, which will be our scale attribute. And now we can change this factor value. This isn't the effect we wanted because the mix blending mode replaces the first attribute with the second attribute. So at a factor of 0, our first attribute scale is active, and at a value of 1, our attribute second scale 2 is active. So we have to change it to add, which adds the both attributes together by this factor value. I'm gonna delete this attribute mix node because I don't want that. And there's no randomness in the rotation, so I'm gonna duplicate this attribute randomize node and change the attribute to rotation. You can change the data type to vector, and now you can change the rotation value on each individual axis. You can set the x and y axis values to 0 and just control the z axis rotation. I'm gonna set that to 360 degrees and a little bit on x and y axis. But there's a problem that these rocks are intersecting the ground. So you might have guessed that we have to add an attribute fill node, change the attribute to position, the data type to vector, and only change the z-axis value. But you are wrong because all the rocks are moved to the same place. And this is happening because every point has a different location on all the three axes. So when we add the attribute fill node and change the value, all those points are moved to the same coordinates. So if we want to move the points on only the z-axis, what we can do is add an point translate node which moves every point of the geometry from the specified amount either from the attribute input or from a vector input. Change this to vector and change the z-axis value. The rocks are scattered everywhere on the plane, which is a waste of memory because all the rocks aren't gonna be rendered. So what you can do is go to weight paint and paint the area where the rocks will be visible. You can paint very well because it doesn't have a lot of vertices. So you can apply the subdivision modifier and now we can paint more smoothly. If by mistake you painted the area where you won't want the rugs, you can decrease down the weight to 0 and decrease down the weight. And now it has created a vertex group. We can rename it to something like density. And now we can type in vertex group as an attribute for the density. So if you are a lazy person, instead of typing, you can hover the mouse over the vertex group and press Ctrl C and then press Ctrl V. Go to object mode and I'm gonna decrease down the density minimum value to 0.45 and increase the maximum density to 0.15. And after deleting the attribute mix node, I forgot to change the attribute back to scale, so rename it to scale. And I'm gonna delete this attribute fill node because it isn't affecting anything. The rocks are pretty huge, so I'm gonna decrease down the density maximum value to 0.3, and I'm also gonna decrease down that density minimum value to 0.15. The rotation is a little bit weird, so I'm gonna tweak the rotation values a little bit. And the rocks are floating in the air, so decrease down the z-axis value to something like 0.07 or something that looks good to you. For me, 0.09 looks good. And if you are a lazy person and don't wanna go deep into the nodes to change a few settings, what you can do is plug any socket into the group input node, and now you can change the settings from the geometry nodes modifier, and you can also rename it by pressing N node, and now you can rename it to something like social distancing. You can also plug this in, rename it to rocks density. And for the grass and the flowers, go to file, append, and navigate where you downloaded the blend file. Double click on that, go to collection and search for grass. Select these two collections, en grass medium new and en grass long new. Then search for grp and select these and select these two collections, grp bluebell and dandelion. And now when we have selected these four collections, hit append. Move these away from the camera. Select the plane, then add a new geometry nodes modifier. Rename it to grass and flowers. Then add a point distribute node. Set the density to 100 and in the density attribute paste the vertex group that we created. Add a point instance node. Change the instance type to collection and select the en grass medium new collection. Then uncheck this whole collection option. Then for the random scale, I'm gonna add an attribute randomize node. In the attribute type in scale, set the minimum value to 0.32 and the maximum to 0.78 or 0.785. Then duplicate the node, change the attribute to rotation, change the data type to vector, set the z-axis value to 360 degrees and the x and y to 0.15. I'm gonna increase the density to 600. Then to get our plane back, I'm gonna add a join geometry node and plug this in. I'm gonna select these nodes and move them up, duplicate them, but this time we are gonna make some larger grass. So change the instance collection to en grass long new, plug this in, duplicate this join geometry node and plug this in. I'm gonna decrease the density to 100 and I'm gonna increase the minimum scale value to 0.65 and the maximum to 1. I'm also gonna randomize this a little bit, something around 0.25. I'm gonna increase this a little bit. You can change the seed value to get a random location. I'm gonna plug this in and rename that to grass medium density. Plug this in also. Rename that to grass long density. I'm gonna duplicate these nodes, but this time we are gonna instance the bluebells. Search for grp bluebell. I'm gonna decrease down the density to 5 and change the seed value. Connect this up, then duplicate the join geometry node and connect this up. These are pretty huge, so I'm gonna decrease down the minimum scale value to about 0.4 and the maximum to 0.6 or 0.62 or something you like. And don't just copy all of my settings. I've experimented the settings a lot before recording this tutorial. So after watching this tutorial, go ahead and experiment. Change the settings for what looks good to you. I'm gonna decrease this down to 0.3. Plug this in and rename it to bluebell density. Now I'm gonna duplicate these for the last time and this time we are gonna select grp dandelion, connect the geometry to the geometry, duplicate the join geometry node and connect the geometry to the geometry. I'm gonna change the maximum scale value to 0.7 or 0.75. I'm also gonna increase the seed value. I'm also gonna randomize this a little bit and then connect this up. Rename that to dandelion density. I'm gonna select the rocks geometry nodes and I'm gonna decrease down the maximum scale value a little bit. Something like this looks good to me. And I'm also gonna decrease the Z translation value. And for the depth of field, I'm gonna add an FT and choose a sphere. I'm gonna move it closer to the camera. something like here, and I'm also going to scale it up a little bit, something like this. Then select the camera, go to object data properties and enable depth of field, and for the focus object select the empty.
So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you learned something new today. If you did, please give it a thumbs up so others can find it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell icon for more videos. I'll be back.